Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. I fully appreciate that I'm what stands between you and a lovely lunch, so I'll do what I can to make every minute count. I have this thing when it comes to the deck, so I just want to make sure it works. Oh, it does, right. So as Jess kindly introduced myself, I'm Anju Solanki. I run a diversity, equity and inclusion consultancy aimed to help organisations build, attract, retain and accelerate underrepresented talent. My work spans across corporates, tech, charities, but the work that I love the most is that I do with sports and sporting organisations. I also commentate for media outlets on matters such as inclusion and mental well-being. I find the beauty of working with a range of sectors is the ability to see what is working well, what isn't, and sharing best practice, because there is no standardized approach to achieving equity and equality. So that benefit of having transparency and visibility in the bid to boost representation across society is more powerful than ever before. Prior to setting up MEA, I was an investment banker. I worked on a trading floor for about 12 years, which was a heavily male-dominated environment. But I can tell you what, having to make my annual sales target of $20 million a year was easier than the job that I have today. Now, me talking about my organisation, my career to you, I suspect many of you here today have had your own organisational hats on, so approaching this conference yesterday, today, from the lens of your employer and what you can take from that. But for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to ask you to take that hat off and wear a personal one instead, because that is where I believe we can make the biggest impact to people around us, and that is where I'm going to be speaking from today. I'm that one there. I'm hoping you're thinking I've flourished since then. As a child, and quite frankly, even into adulthood, I wasn't exposed to conversations around fairness, inequality, difference. The world was what it was, and one we accepted for what it was. As a British Indian, we were ostracised from our local communities. My parents got divorced when I was very young, and divorce was unheard of in Indian communities back then. So the experience of exclusion started quite young for me. We grew up with little resources, but the world was what it was, and one I accepted for what it was, the beauty of childhood. But at some point later on, I realised my life experiences were entirely different to the majority of people I ended up working with later on in banking. Where they were enjoying their nice starting salaries and going on wonderfully exotic holidays, I was saving to help my mum pay for her mortgage. Where they were quite confident in taking clients out to a golf day, in attending the work ski event over Christmas, in going to the off-site playing korfball, a sport I'd never even heard of to the moment I turned up for it. The light shone really quite clearly. They had been exposed, in fact encouraged, to a broad range of sports from a young age, a privilege I had not shared to the same extent. As immigrants in this country aim to create a better future for their children, my mum had taken her risks. The priority was to provide stability and be risk-averse. It was quite typical of that culture and that generation. Life is just a maths equation. The focus for me at school was on science, it was on maths, for my sisters too. So when my sister came home every year winning the cross-country race, when she won Sportsperson of the Year every year, she begged my mum to take her to the local running tracks. My mum didn't even know what a track was. That's her over there. Sorry, just in the corner. She's flourished too, on the right-hand side, Pooja. She eventually got to tracks. She begged for a coach. She eventually got the coach. She was very talented. It led her to run for Great Britain for the under-21s. That meant an investment of time, so much time. She was asked to join the training for the 2004 Olympics in Athens. In her bid to be the best person she could, she was constantly told in one form or another, what are the chances that an Indian woman can make it to elite athlete status? All that travelling, all the races, came at an expense to her academic journey. And that was when the ultimatum came for her, where the cultural expectations, the gender stereotypes, the parental influence did not give her the support she needed to continue. For in her support circle, academics and sport merely could not coexist. She gave up competitions to focus on studying. She's a dentist now, her outlet is the gym, but it shines a light on a bigger picture. Being a girl, coming from a low socioeconomic backdrop, coming from cultural heritage, adds layers and layers of invisible barriers that people in society, even today, are still unaware of. And when I think of my daughter, I want her to have more opportunities than what I had. And that's my personal motivation for change. It was the reason I set up my business. I'd like you to take a moment with your organisational hat off and think, how much does this mean to you? How meaningful is this and why? For it is our personal motivations for change that will create the biggest impact on people around us. And that is the heart of true allyship. Now, allyship is a wonderful buzzword these days. You can stick it on the front of anything, and people think you're inclusive. It's fantastic. Unfortunately, not many people know what it actually means. And it's so powerful because it relates to each and every one of us. So allyship is a relationship based on 3 fundamentals: trust, consistency, and accountability. We can be allies outside of our organisations, as parents, as friends, as advocates. For we still live in a world where, despite all of these efforts to date to increase the participation of women in sports and physical activity, the overall increase has been just under 1%. There are 3 types of people in this world when it comes to equity and equality. The active resistors, they're about 15% of society. The quiet middle, most people, they care, not their responsibility. And then the enthusiastic advocates, 15%. And it's the latter that are likely to be allies on a consistent basis. But we need to see that spread now across to the wider population. So how? How can you make a difference? How can we make a difference? There are different roles we can take on when it comes to allyship. I always advocate for this. It depends on what you feel comfortable with and what privileges you experience. A sponsor, opening doors. Everyone in this room knows and understands the broad range of careers in sports. And I see there are parallels with sports and tech. People think to work in sports, you need to be a high-performing athlete. In the same way, to work in tech, you need to be a geeky programmer. That's a privilege you all share in this room, that knowledge and education. Being an amplifier, you might watch a match, and these days notice there's a female sports commentator. She said something great. Scope out your room. If there are people there, repeat what she said and credit that woman to help shift that perspective and boost credibility. And we can do that in meetings too. Be a champion. Most of us as humans are too scared to articulate our aspirations because it seems unrealistic. So me, I'm a 40-year-old woman, pretty confident, go to the gym 5 to 6 times a week. And I've been toying with the idea of wanting to start boxing or learn football. And every time I go for it, my inner critical voice overtakes and brings me back to my routine. Positive words of encouragement can go so far, Don't underestimate the power you have there. An advocate. We saw the power of the 2023 Women's World Cup. Post that, 9 out of 10 girls said it had a positive impact. I took my children to the FA Cup Women's Final on Sunday, and it was beyond amazing. That momentum has come from the advocates, those allies who have kept up that momentum of celebrating the progress we've seen in women's sport. So I ask you today, challenge those limiting assumptions. We still live in a world where, as of today, boys as young as 5 learn that sports is not for girls. If there's a sport you like, look into volunteering. Listen to the language that you use when you speak about particular sports. Because it all starts with people. People like you, people like me. To see inclusion as our responsibility. There's a need for each one of us to tap into our emotional intelligence, to be curious of the lived experiences of underrepresented groups. For that, create safe spaces for people to speak up, normalizing that vulnerability. I often get asked, Anju, what's at the heart of a truly sustainable change towards a fairer society? And I always answer with empathy, to be able to put yourself in the shoes of others, which as most humans struggle to do. My favorite way to describe this, if anyone's heard me speak before, is the elephant and mouse syndrome. You can put an elephant in the same room as a mouse. The elephant doesn't need to know anything about the mouse if it's to survive and thrive. The mouse needs to know everything about the elephant if it is to survive. And the same plays true for dominant and non-dominant groups. Dominant groups have more power, and non-dominant groups have to be very adaptable if they're to thrive in the same environment. You can put 2 people in the very same room of the exact same event, and they can both have entirely different interpretations and feelings of that experience. I get to this point where I sometimes think I'm talking about animals to explain human concepts, but I take the notion that if that lands with my children, it should hopefully land with a more grown-up crowd. But changing our lens requires a growth mindset, and I can share with you today that I've gone on that journey myself. In delivering diversity training, I started noticing, okay, this would shift attitudes, but was it necessarily landing and changing behaviours? I had to look for the lessons in my own work, and it took me to 2 things, data and innovation, and asking myself, how can we use tech for good to drive social change? In 2021, I partnered up with a virtual reality company, combining neuroscience, virtual reality research, to create these real-life scenes where you or me can be embodied into a different avatar, where John Smith can be embodied into his black female colleague and experience firsthand some of the microaggressions she faces on a daily basis. And science shows us that as humans, if we're embodied into a different representation, we take on its ownership. What does that mean? It means we feel things more than we would do simply just witnessing them. That's been proven to increase empathy, to scientifically reduce bias, and we're beginning to see through studies creating behavioural change. We successfully rolled out the gender and race module to the NHS and worldwide organisations. We're now seeing national governing bodies looking at how they can incorporate AI into their equity, diversity and inclusion strategies, looking for more personalised and connected routes to reducing discrimination in sports, and we're now connecting with them to help support their efforts. Just imagine the impact of a football coach being able to be embodied into a young Indian avatar's player and experience and hear his fears and thoughts coming onto the pitch for the first time. For an elite represented player to be embodied into an underrepresented player's avatar and experience dressing room banter from a different lens. it is that empathy and curiosity that is going to help and support each one of us to naturally become allies to each other. With technology and data carving more sophisticated and credible approaches to meeting our diversity and inclusion goals, we hope to see an acceleration in progress towards social change. And as I close up, I'd like you to remember something. Noise does not always translate into action, and it does not always translate into results. In 2020, I went on the BBC to release the global gender gap results from the World Economic Forum. I spoke about how it was close to 100 years to close the gender gap. I stand here today to tell you it's widened to 132 years. So I ask of you, please do not underestimate your power. You have an impact on people around you. If we all take small, consistent daily actions, we will see results. Finally, create community, learn from each other. Going into this lunch break now, talk to each other. A few years ago, I worked with women in sport, and they had a wonderful community called Wise Women, women across different national governing bodies. Whilst I ran programs for them, I saw the biggest value was them actually talking to each other and sharing the progress and challenges. We know each sport has its own barriers, its own nuances, but it's also making their own strides of progress. So actively talk, actively engage, and create your own communities. On that note, speaking from my heart as Anju, from my head as a diversity consultant, I do genuinely believe it's an exciting time to be a woman. And I think it's an exciting time to be human, because I think we're working on becoming a kinder, more empathetic and curious society, and that's where the real magic happens. Thank you so much.